White text over video of past events. Logo, Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. Professional Development Series presents Intro to Cultural Accessibility for Visitors with Disabilities. On stage, seated at a table, are three women. Above them is a screen with projected captions and slides. To their right, a man stands and addresses the audience.
On behalf of all of us here at Core Theater in the University of Chicago, thank you so much and for coming. We're very excited to host everybody here as well as the CCAC. And I'm glad we're doing this. I went to this a few years ago, actually during the 25th anniversary of the ADA, and I learned so much. And I learned, but I continue to learn. I think that's why we're all here. Here at Core Theater, you know, we're not the perfect venue, which we know it's very hard to find a perfect venue in the city. However, after going to that workshop that I think you did a few years ago, one of the things that we tried to do was to make it my direct job is to make it more accessible for the patrons. I feel like that we got a great starting point, and we are continuing to work with that and work on that. As well as we are working with the University of Chicago to make it more accessible also for our patrons and also for our performers and our artistic staff as well. And I think that's all I'd like to say. So thank you again so much for joining us. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, Evan, or Hillary. You have my email. So I'd be happy to answer any questions for anybody after this workshop or in the future. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Pearson, and I'm going to introduce a little bit about what CCAC is, introduce our panel, and kind of go over a few of our kind of traditional ground rules for these types of days. So I'm Hillary. I'm a steering committee member for CCAC, which is the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. And to my right, I have Christina Gunther, who is the founder of CCAC, and she also works for Evanston Arts Center as Director of Education. And then to my left is Rachel Arfa, who is another steering committee member and also works for Equip for Quality. So what CCAC is, just kind of in a nutshell, if you're new to us, our mission is to empower cultural spaces in Chicagoland to be more accessible to visitors, patrons, guests, staff who have disabilities. We do that through professional development workshops such as this today. We do that through a shared access calendar that lists a lot of performances that are featuring accessible programming. And we also do that through an equipment loan program, which we'll get a little bit more into as we go throughout this session. Kind of a few ways that we kind of facilitate that in these settings is that we want to make sure that everybody feels and knows that this is a safe space. Not everyone comes in to these types of programs or experiences with the same level of know-how, of terminology, of practice, and we want to make sure people know that this is a place that you can feel safe. Don't feel uncomfortable that you can't say something if you don't necessarily know the right language about something or to describe something. That's fine. We're all here to grow and learn together. And then we try to poll the audience a little bit and see kind of where everyone's coming from. So by raise of hand or clap or whatever you're comfortable with, or snap, how many folks in the room are executive director level? Okay, artistic director. We got executive director. Folks who work production. Great. Oh yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 or 5. Folks who work front of house, visitor service, patron services. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8 or 9, 10 folks. Great. How many fundraisers or marketing side of things? 1, 2, 3, about 3 people. How many folks in the room who've been frustrated by an experience that they've had in a cultural or arts venue, either as a patron or as someone providing a service? That's pretty much everyone. Oh my gosh. And I think that's one of the biggest things too. I think what that shows really for us is that everyone in this room is here to do better and to learn new practices and to connect with new people. And that starts with being in this room, meeting the people around you. As something that Matthew said was, none of us have the perfect venue. None of us have no barriers in terms of how our space is laid out, or how we can make a change. But we can all do incremental things, and we can all do things where we partner and we learn from each other, and it's all about that incremental growth and changing the philosophy in our organizations. So with that, I also will close and say, for questions today, there will be a nice chunk at the end for Q&A. We will be facilitating that through texts. You can text Evan. Yes, you can text that number, which is 773-968-3258. And now you have Evan Hatfield's personal cell phone number. So if you have any questions throughout, or if you don't want to write things down, you're welcome to text him throughout as things pop into your brain. And also you can write them out. We have some little Post-it notes, and we'll be collecting those to then kind of collect them and share them out as we kind of get rid of ones that are maybe repeats and things like that. So that's the format. That's the plan format for today. Great. So now we're going to transition to a little patron experience portion. We have Rachel Arfa here, and we're going to do a few prepared questions about experience in cultural settings and her take. Hi, Rachel. So the first question we wanted to talk to you about was, what are the challenges or barriers that you find that keep you from fully participating in cultural experiences?
Thanks for having me here anyway. First, because I provided that I need communication access to be able to go to cultural events. For example, right now you see Google Captioning here, which will be provided by Kathy Bacon here in the lovely peach shirt. And she's using software that many different pieces of software, but one of them is TextTab. So that allows you to project the captioning at top of the slide like what you see right now. So for most cultural events, I prefer open captioning. Sometimes I use English interpreters, but it really depends on the setting. But even though I talk, and you may think that because I talk, I can hear, but I really do need to rely on captioning in order to be able to understand in cultural event. And Chicago has made huge progress we have so many venues that are providing captioning or other types of communication access, but we want to do even more, so that's part of why we're here today.
Great. What advice would you give to cultural spaces who are, starting down the path of accessible programming? What are your first steps?
So I think that one of the first steps is what you are doing here today, which is coming to a CCAC program, and not only because we are great resource for each other, but also it's helpful to understand what other organizations are doing, what is possible, what kind of technology or equipment they're using. I think that we can really learn from each other. Nobody has to invent a whole new route all by themselves. And that was one thing that I learned when we first started the CCAC, was that I met so many different people who work at the organization, and they felt like me being the only person responsible for pushing access. But when you come here, you can really meet other people who are in the same boat. So that's the first step, I think. So congratulations, if this is the first time. But I would also go and watch as much as you can about other different types of ways to provide access. And I would also talk to people with disabilities too.
What are your tips for what not to do when you're kind of starting out this process?
So I think that you want to start small. I think that it's very easy to be very efficient in saying you're going to do captioning and sign language interpreters and audio description and more accessory body in the first year. I think that if that is your goal, I would encourage you to take a step back and take one of those types of access. And because some of the work that you will do to set up that program will help you with the others. For example, let's say you wanting to start providing open captioning for your shows. Now, because so many theaters are providing captioning in Chicago, it's not enough just to provide the access service, for example, open captioning. You also need to make sure that you request into your staff. Make sure you train your front of house staff on how to communicate with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Make sure to train your box office so that if somebody calls and asks for tickets to accessible performance to a museum tour, that your box office is knowledgeable and able to share that, because there is nothing more frustrating than finding out about an access service and trying to navigate that with the box office staff that does not know anything about what you're asking for. That is a barrier. But I really cannot emphasize the importance of customer service. That is what is going to make your access program shine, and it's going to help you build that relationship with your patrons.
Absolutely. And I think something else too is an important thing that Rachel mentioned and has also been mentioned by Matthew and me earlier, is that it's that incremental level of change. It's knowing that you might, when you hear about all the things that we're going to talk about today, for those who are not familiar with that or thinking, wow, there's so much out there, we have to do it all at once, it's about being able to kind of focus on that customer service aspect and the small things you can do now to set yourself up for success later. Do you have any examples, without naming names, of cultural institutions that have not met your expectation, or like experiences that have maybe not met expectation? Oh,
And I'm interrupting just to say there's a story that Rachel shared with me a long time ago from going to a museum in DC with your brother, if you remember that story, that has stuck with me, that might be really useful for people to hear your perspective.
Sure. So Christina mentioned this story. It happened a long time ago, but it still stands out as one of the worst examples that I have experienced. So before I lived in Chicago, a couple of cities before I lived in Washington, D.C., and it was one of my first jobs out of college, and I had a paycheck, I had an apartment, I felt great about having my family come and see that I was independent. And so when they came, my brother came too, and my brother and I went out for an afternoon by ourselves. And we decided to go to a brand new museum that had just opened, and it was the talk of the town because it was very exciting. So we arrived at this museum, and they had a video that was related to the contacts at the museum, and the video was not captioned. And so we got me, my brother is hearing, and he's younger, but he's used to, he's had experiences. He could tell like there was access radar almost. They could think, okay, but maybe just the first video. And as we went further to this museum, there were more TV screens which were directly related to this exhibit. and absolutely none of them were captioned. And I was trying to be like, the big sister is okay, equality is okay, but I was trying to hide the discomfort because I knew they meant that I cannot share the experience. But my brother was also trying to do the same, but I could see in his eyes the realization that this museum was not meant for us. It was not meant for a sister who's there and a brother who could hear the experience together. Essentially, this museum was not meant for me. It was not welcoming to me, and I could just see the look in his eyes grow deeper and deeper as any hope that this museum had that about people who were about how to feeling vanished. And we both left that museum very down and depressed because being that we had this exciting afternoon ahead of us and it's to a brand new museum, and that was not the case. And I mean, that was really very, it was one of those moments where I felt very let down by this museum. And Washington, D.C. had a very high population of deaf hard of hearing people. They completely disregarded the deaf and hard of hearing community. And not surprisingly, a few years later, there was a lawsuit because that museum would not be accessible to all types of disabilities. But you know, most times you don't go somewhere by yourself. You go somewhere with your sibling, or at a date, or with your spouse, or with the friend. People with disabilities go into spaces and we share spaces together. So that experience was disappointing, not just for me, but also for my brother, who does not have a disability.
On the flip side of that situation, is there any highlight of a really great experience that you'd be willing to share?
There are so many, and we were so lucky. I moved back to Chicago in 2011, and there was maybe one open caption show every 4 months, and now there are so many open caption plays almost every week. Then so there are a lot of great places doing really great work. I received one. I had a great experience where I know that the box office has been tweaked, so anytime I try to buy tickets, we will communicate with them about box office, about my tickets. They know exactly where the access performances are. They know what time. For example, the access performances are always at 3 o'clock on a weekend. What time. I called it with the 7 o'clock. They said, oh, it's 7 o'clock. I immediately knew then that they did not know. So we just knew that they could be aware when the access performances are, but also be planning to communicate the information. And then when I arrived, sometimes they have volunteers that welcome me, and then it is nice to have staff come around and check and make sure this is okay. Sometimes I buy tickets, and if the captions were here, the tickets that I'm given, even after seeing I'm deaf and I need to see the captions will be all the way over there. That's not a box office, that's on top of it. So you better make sure that when you please customer to tell you they need captions, please, so that they can have it on the same time. But the customer service really stands out.
And then, how do you feel accessible programming should be marketed and communicated to the community?
Well, first I'm going to come up with the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium Access Calendar. If you go to our website, there's an access calendar that is all of our accessible performances. So it is a good way for you to know who else is providing access. But the other think that I think it's really helpful that I cannot stress enough is word of mouth. So you want to build relationships with your patrons. And so when your patrons come for performance, make sure to hold yourself out as a representative of that, of the organization, because I know that you represent your leaders, so if I have a problem, I know I can come to you and say, hey, I had this experience, I want to provide some good feedback. That way you build that relationship here when you have that customer service. I could go somewhere and I could say to my friend, hey, I went to this great show, Hillary was awesome, it's so easy to buy tickets, and that they remember that, and that word of mouth kind of gets it out. But you have to hold yourself out, you go and meet your patrons, so I would take the initiative to go out and present to different organizations. For example, if you have you may want to go and present to the Hearing Class Association of America. They have a chapter, they have some in other parts of our region who provide groups, there's a lot of groups of people who like a vision. Go out there and present it and share with them what your access objects are, and then invite them to come to your show. The other thing that I think is really helpful is to have a discount for your tickets. This is not a requirement, but what it does is it sends a message that you want people with disabilities to come, but also if you have to pick one day for an access performance, it's like you would communicate, you let your people know that you pick the date. It is, you kind of acknowledge that, but also by providing an access ticket price, it gives you more the attitude in case something goes wrong. Maybe there's a miscommunication with the house staff. It gives you a little bit of the attitude when that happens. There are times when I pay full price. It was hard for me to pay full price. It is still messed up my CD. I found myself reacting differently because I paid full price. I should be getting everything the access that I need. It is still was not a perfect, smooth experience. So that's another way to help people that will do us. And most of the leaders offer prices too. So that's something to keep in mind too. I think that it really helps the community. That want people with disabilities to come and do us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. That's a really good perspective as we move into kind of breaking things down section by section with this PowerPoint.
Looking at today's focus, so we really appreciate having Rachel's perspective, and we felt like that was a good place to get started. And then from there, wanted to talk a little bit about what we're doing for today. So the key, like Hillary said, is incremental. So we will keep saying that over and over again because I think these types of things have a tendency to really overwhelm, and we don't want you to walk away being like, there's so much to do, I don't know how to get started, so I'm not going to do anything. So we're trying to break everything down as much as we can. So we're going to start out by first of all just explaining what disability is and trying to give you some context about who we're talking about, and then give you some tips for how to get started. Then we'll look at some different types of services that we can offer, kind of breaking that down by different types of disabilities. And then most importantly, how do we communicate that we are accessible? All of this stuff is great to offer, but if no one knows about it, then it's not going to do anything. And then also trying to kind of empower you to get started and stay connected with us. So we're going to begin by talking about what is disability, and all of these different slides I think could be their own like 2-day conference. So don't worry, this won't be a 2-day conference, but what is disability? One of the definitions, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, says that disability is someone who has a record of or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And major life activities could be eating, breathing, walking, talking, seeing, etc.
And then a few other definitions. The World Health Organization defines disability as a contextual variable, dynamic over time and in relation to circumstances. One is more or less disabled based on the interactions between the person and the individual, the institution, and the social environment they are in. And when we talk about social environment and kind of how that has changed in terms of how we view disability, there are two sort of models of disability that have existed, and then have sort of cultural arts institutions and a lot of individuals like we're viewing it, the model of disability as the social model of disability as opposed to the medical. In the past, disability was thought of as more of a medical model, as in your doctor diagnosed you as disabled and you needed to be fixed. There was something wrong, you needed to be fixed. You were the problem. And as opposed to the social construct and the construct that we ascribe to, which is society needing to eliminate the barriers to allow for access, and the relation to the environment around us and what we can do to eliminate barriers.
And a good example I have of just thinking about the social model is just thinking about if I was a wheelchair user and I was coming to a museum that had a bunch of steps. I, as a wheelchair user, did not put those steps there. The museum, the institution chose to put the steps there. So I'm not the problem, it's the institution that chose to put the steps there. So it's kind of shifting the focus from the individual to us as a society and as an institution.
And then that kind of leads into equal versus equitable versus inclusive design. In this next slide, there's 3 different pictures. The first picture is a gentleman using a wheelchair, in a wheelchair, a woman and a man, and they're all standing on a box. They're all on equally sized boxes to overlook a picket fence to see what's on the other side of the fence. This is an example of people being treated equally based on the assumption that everyone needs the same supports. So everybody needs a box at the same height to see over the fence. In the second picture, it's demonstrating equitable. It's providing them with 3 different supports to realize equal access. The gentleman using the wheelchair is on a taller box to look over the fence. The woman is on a shorter box but still needs that height, and the man doesn't require a box. So this is treating equitably by kind of meeting people where they're at, and not assuming that they all need the same supports. And then inclusive design, and kind of what Christina was saying about like the barrier is the institution needing to rethink what that is for their visitor experience. It's the systemic barrier is removed. So in this last picture, all 3 of these individuals don't need any supports. The fence is a chain link fence, and you can see through it and see what's happening without having to add anything equipment-wise or support-wise. They're all having that inclusive experience.
So how many people with disabilities are there? There's a lot of different ways that we could go about talking about statistics, but a really quick and easy one is that 1 in 5 Americans has some type of disability. And what disability is, as we saw from these different definitions, can really run the gamut. So it could be a very visible disability, it could be a wheelchair user, it could be someone who's blind with a white cane, but we also could be talking about a lot of other different types of disabilities, like people on the autism spectrum, or people with different learning disabilities, or other maybe mobility disabilities, but they don't use something visible for us to know that they have a disability. The other thing to keep in mind too is that some people identify as having a disability, but other people don't. Thinking about my dad, who's now starting to lose his hearing as he ages, he would never in a million years, he'd be really mad that I'm even saying this, but he would never identify as having a disability, yet he benefits from having captioning when we're watching TV, or he would benefit from assistive listening devices if we went to a performance or to a tour at a museum. So another thing to keep in mind is 1 in 5 people has a disability. It doesn't mean that they're going to seek out disability services.
And then a few other numbers to think about too. 77.3 million baby boomers make up 25% of the U.S. population. That number is only going to continue to grow. It's estimated by the year 2030, there will be more citizens over the age of 60 than under the age of 30. And this is also really to Christina's point about folks who don't necessarily identify having a disability, the aging population. What are the services that we can put in place to make sure that they have a seamless transition to continue enjoying the arts and cultural activities that they want to be engaged with. 37% of seniors over the age of 65 in Illinois identify as having a disability. And then many older people or people who acquire disability later in life may never identify as having a disability.
One of the things that I've encountered when talking and training other people in cultural organizations is I don't know what to say, and sort of this fear of what to say or what not to say really stops people from actually saying anything at all. And that's one of the reasons why at CCAC we really try to foster a safe space, because if we can't even talk about it, then nothing's going to change, nothing's going to get better. And so a really quick and easy rule of thumb, which again is to say that language is complicated, and I think we all know that at this stage of our society, but language is complicated. The easy way to train your staff and the easy way to train your institution is in the customer service language, is people first language. So really remembering that people with disabilities are people first. We're not going to say the disabled or the handicapped, we're going to say people with disabilities, and that's what we've been saying throughout this talk. Or you could say the disabled people, but the point is that they're people. You would say she uses a wheelchair rather than she is wheelchair bound, making it kind of removing the sensationalizing from it and just saying matter-of-factly how she gets around. We would say people who are blind or people who have low vision rather than the blind. People who are deaf or hard of hearing instead of saying the deaf or the hearing impaired. He has a cognitive disability would be a better way than saying he has special needs. Or, I mean, if we're really old school, thinking of like terms like retarded or mongoloid, those terms are not okay to say anymore. Then also looking at how we're talking about accessible services, so accessible seat, accessible parking, accessible bathroom. Those are really positive ways to talk about those spaces rather than handicap seating or handicap parking.
And also we want to try really hard to avoid some of the euphemisms that have come about that in some ways have tried to like put like a positive, approachable spin on some of this language. Like different abilities or differently able. You still see that in places. Special needs is something that you see a lot. Handy capable. If you mean disability, just say disability. Hashtag say the word.
Yeah, I feel like people really dance about, well, I don't know if I should say disability, so I'm gonna make up these fun little words that I think mean the same thing, but frankly, if you do like that, it makes you look like number one, you're not comfortable with saying the word disability, and number two, don't really understand your audience. I think it's really important to say disability. It helps the disability community to understand that you are intending to talk to them.
And then just some other caveats to say that language is fluid and changing. We had to put this on a slide just to be sure that we actually said that. So it is really complicated, and this could be like a really good conference session or a really good conference topic to just explore language. And also remembering that people with disabilities might have their own different ways of talking and referring to themselves, just as we're talking about any other groups of people. So some people with disabilities prefer identity-first language. So like people on the autism spectrum might refer to themselves as autistic. I'm an autistic person. So I think being aware that this nuance exists, and just when you're interacting with a person one-on-one, take a cue from how they refer to themselves, and you can refer to them in the way that they refer to themselves, or even ask like, what's your preference when you're talking to an individual. But if we're talking about marketing materials, or we're talking about putting something up on Facebook or anything else, your default should just be people first language.
And also we want to be thinking about things in terms of beyond just like ADA compliance in terms of how we label things. So ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Accessible means easy to reach, enter, speak with, or use. Instead of saying, and I hear this a lot, I know I've been someone who's done this in the past, of saying ADA seating, ADA restroom. It's not it's not the Americans with Disabilities Act restroom or parking or seating. It is accessible seating, and those are a separate thing to think about.
Even when I see things that say, do you need any ADA accommodation, it feels very still, very, not like all you're trying to do is do the minimal amount of compliance rather than taking some time to think, how am I going to be welcoming, what language am I going to use? I see that especially with government. A lot of time government was saying this restroom is ADA accessible, well, we provide ADA accommodation. I would much rather you do what Hilary suggested, is say we provide access, these are the types of access we provide, and not use the ADA term. We should not really have to use it, but
Excellent. So, do we have a mic runner by chance who could help out?
We do.
Yes, all right, great. So we like to get you guys thinking. So there are kind of 5 main, like big bullet point reasons to be accessible. So,
And maybe like way more,
There's
but
pro-
5 we chose to talk
there's
about.
probably more. There's probably more, but if you get these 5, you're doing great. So can anyone think of a reason why a cultural institution should be accessible? And if you do, raise your hand and wait for the mic, and so you can say your answer.
I feel like we need a drum roll.
Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer to me, but to be more inclusive, to be equitable. I really like the graphic. I've seen that graphic before about the different delineations of equitable, but the inclusive design was really, spot
Yeah,
on.
that chain link fence really got me too. Yeah.
Yeah, so that falls under it's the right thing to do. So yes, that's definitely, everyone has the right to fully participate in the cultural life of their community. As empathetic humans, being inclusive and considering the experiences different than our own is essential, and things that us in the arts world, the cultural world, are thinking about every day and trying to figure out ways to apply. So yes, it's the right thing to do to be inclusive. Don't try to keep up with the slides with this. This one's tricky. Any other thoughts? Here,
If you would please, pass it on.
It's good for the bottom line.
all right, yes, it makes good business sense. Discretionary income for working age people with disabilities is about $21 billion. That's according to the Americans Institute for Research. 75% of America's wealth is also controlled by folks who are 55 and older, having the most disposable income to do things that they enjoy, like going to the theater, going to museums, and going to performances in general. And really, yeah, we don't want to be turning away potential revenue and customers, and there's a lot of trust built when you're doing these types of programming and allowing for access, that you get one person, they tell their friends, they bring more, and you're creating more revenue. Yeah. Anyone else have a guess?
That's 2.
So
We're
for
keeping
two
track.
folks, it's so neither of them are plants. So.
Okay.
Oh, ooh, yeah. You always have to give
This
us
guy's a
extra
plan.
props. Yeah.
He works in a
I'm pretty sure it's the law.
It's the law. It's the law, for sure. Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973, Americans with Disabilities Act, revised ADA regulations, effective communication regulations. Rachel, you had a few others that you had brought up too.
the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance, the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance, and the Illinois Human Rights Ordinance all say that you cannot discriminate because someone based on their disability.
That's why we have a lawyer here.
Any other thoughts? We got 3, which is great. Oh,
I'm going around the back.
he's running. He's running.
It sets an example for the community, so it helps establish a sort of community and cultural norm.
Good. Oh, that's a good one. It kind of fits into a few different ones of like doing the right thing and being inclusive, and how, I'll say this one, how disability affects all of us. Anyone that may become disabled at any time due to an accident, illness, genetics, aging, etc. As we age, we're more likely to develop a disability or multiple disabilities. 1 in 3 families has a family member with a disability. It could happen to any one of us along any part of our journey of life, and being able to know, and if you're a lover of arts and culture, of having those things set up that you can continue to enjoy, and with the people around you. That's really important. Anything else? We got 4 of them. That's really good.
Now this is just like reading our minds. Can
Yeah.
anyone do it? Ooh, we gotta
You have
take
a non-plan.
None of it.
Potential mind readers. Oh my god.
I read this on the slide that's on my piece of
Way
paper.
to go. What kind of a plan?
And this, yeah, kind of a plan. It says it's in our mission.
Correct.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. I mean, most of us have missions that include words such as diversity, inclusivity, belonging, accessible, everyone, all. So as you're thinking about that and what speaks to your mission and what are things that, you know, are potentially really helpful in your arsenal as you're talking to upper ups and thinking about this is what we are here for, of making sure that you are being inclusive of everyone with disabilities when you have words like diversity and inclusivity as part of your mission. So great job, everyone. We got them all. I think there's one slide that has them all, maybe.
Yeah.
Sure. Ta-da! Hooray! I know, I just like lost my voice. That's fine.
Okay, great. So we've made some compelling reasons for why accessibility matters, why we should try to be inclusive. So how do we get started? These slides that we're on.
Okay, yes. I have an image to describe. So in this image, it's a red sign with white lettering reading, "Keep calm and make it accessible," with the universal wheelchair symbol above the language.
So this was just to say, relax, we're going to tell you more about how to become more accessible. You are actually, right?
My God, please mix it up. Oh no. Your organization can foster access and inclusion by allocating and leveraging resources, establishing and implementing policy. So allocating and leveraging resources is thinking about budgeting, your staff, who you can train, who's on board, who, you know, how you can think about planning for the future and accessibility with your budget. Establishing and implementing policy, like creating an access plan for your entire team, creating training materials, giving or taking authority, which is really key, especially when you're talking about customer service and that training aspect, being able to train others from all staff levels, from your upper executives all the way down to folks who are on the floor, visitor services, anyone who's in your space, representing you in your organization. You're leading by example and action through marketing and partnerships, using CCAC as a resource. The LEAD Conference, which is, if you're not familiar, the Leadership Exchange in Arts and Disability, which is an annual conference from the Kennedy Center that's in always in early August, that goes through a bunch of different topics and areas for access, and people from all over the world come. And then, you know, leading by example and action is connecting with people in this room, making those, meeting a new person, talking about your challenges, talking about the things that your successes, things that you want to grow on, and really trying to foster those relationships.
So some good questions to ask as we're getting started, because ideally we would all be starting like from the start, like with a fresh institution, just starting like, this is what we would want to do, this is how we want things to be. We all know, I mean, maybe someone's from a new institution we don't know about yet, but I think for the most part, most of us are coming from institutions that have a really long history. The Evanston Arts Center where I work is turning 90 this year. So that's a long time, and that's a lot of history, which is really positive within the community, but it's also means that it's requires some change and growing and kind of addressing and focusing on accessibility. So some good questions to ask as we get started. Can everyone, and we now know even more with our disability context who everyone is, truly experience and engage with us? Does a person with a disability feel like they are treated the same as someone without a disability? Thinking about Rachel's story with her brother at the museum in DC. Did she feel the same as a hearing person? And unfortunately the answer was no from that experience. Does our staff have the tools needed to be successful? That's a good question just in general at our institutions, but this is something really important to think about. Does our staff have everything that they need or the beginnings of what they need to be successful? And does a person with a disability feel considered or like an afterthought in our space?
And after you're kind of going through some of these initial questions around the room, you want to be evaluating the places your guests interact with you. The venue. You want to walk or roll the patron path. Consider the physical access to your venue, such as are there entrances that are ramped, not just stairs, accessible parking available, accessible restroom stalls, accessible seating, doors that aren't too heavy to open if somebody wanted to maintain independence within your space. Consider information and content access. Is information provided with only sighted or hearing guests in mind? Is information in multiple formats for guests who are blind or low vision? You want to try to building structural changes after 2010 requires total ADA compliance by 2010 regulations. So there have been a couple rounds of those updates with architectural design, and so there's no real grandfather clause. Just because your building is old does not mean that your business does not have to comply with the ADA. If a customer decides to file a lawsuit against you not complying with the ADA, they will probably win. The court will look into what you spend on other things, and they will decide if you have money to be compliant or where your priorities are. There is only a provision called safe harbor in the revised ADA regulations, which means you do not have to make modifications if you comply with the 1991 standards. However, if you choose to alter elements, you have to comply with the 2010 standards and regulations.
And to make that a little simpler too, is just to say if you're going to remodel something, you better make it accessible. And if you have the money to put in some fancy new bathroom, then you should have the money to make it accessible. So that is how I
In a
interpret it.
nutshell. And like, there's a good resource, and we can talk about resources, and we'll share everything out to everyone here. But that CCAC self-evaluation tool that's out in the lobby goes through a lot of different areas and contexts for this type of kind of self-evaluation as you're getting started as well.
And then other ways and other places that we interact with our guests, it's not just our physical spaces, but it's also online, the internet, the World Wide Web. I feel like saying that since we're in such a darkened room to tell you about the World Wide Web. But basically thinking about, can someone who is deaf or blind engage with us like everyone else? If you have a video, is that video captioned? If you are blind using a screen reader, are you able to access your organization's website? So thinking about that, also thinking about, is there access information available online with the contact person identified? And I feel like this is, I add this to every slide that I ever do for something like this, but I think like Rachel also mentioned, it's so important to be able to actually have a face to access at your organization, and it's everyone's job for sure, but there also needs to be a point person, and that point person needs to be identified online, so that if I was researching information, because Rachel certainly will tell you before she goes to a museum or theater, she's going to be doing a lot of online research to find out what's available, to see if she needs to request anything in advance. So she's going to do a lot of legwork. In order to do that, she's going to need to know, like, who does she need to talk to, or who does she need to email with, and that person should be clearly spelled out.
And then you also want to be thinking about surveying your audience and prioritize. What does your existing audience need the most or first? Let's start providing accommodations for them right away, or create a plan for those things to be established, those incremental changes. Who are we surveying for these questions? Do you have regular audience members that you have built trust with, that you know maybe identify, that you can start reaching out to and creating a rapport with when you're thinking about how to expand your services. Thinking about what features would grow and diversify your audiences down the road, thinking about folks who are aging, just thinking about all the different offerings that are happening in the city and how do you stay competitive and how do you stay on top of that length of that knowledge and building that skill set.
And then really try and seek to institute best practices. I think all of this, like we keep saying, incremental change, we should make a drinking game where we say incremental change, and you could drink this water. But the goal is to try to emulate best practices, and we're going to get there together. Nobody's perfect, and I've worked at a great institution and a really not so great institution with Access, and there's a lot of similarities actually. So no one's at a perfect place, but really trying and striving to institute best practices. Some really key takeaways when we're talking about that is that your guests should never feel like you're doing them a favor by providing accessibility, and that's a big piece. And when we're talking about like going above compliance, and we're talking about like ADA seat versus accessible seat, that's one of the ways where you're showing that you really are welcoming people. Thinking about the box office staff, or thinking about visitor services staff at your museum, thinking about how they're welcoming people, and how you're interacting with people who might make a request. So if you've received a request by email or over the phone that you've never received before, play it cool. Just take a beat and say, like, let me get back to you, before you're like, take a sigh and like, oh God, an ASL interpreter is gonna cost $150. And just start making the person who is requesting to come to your institution feel like crap for asking for this. We really want to present accessibility as no different from anyone needing to use the restroom or need a chair to sit in, or parking information, all of these different things that we share to ensure a positive experience for our guests. The accessibility accommodations that we provide should just be as seamless and shared in different ways like we share that other information. Another thing to remember when we're talking about best practices is a big one, which is it's never a one-size-fits-all. It's never you're deaf, so you're going to use ASL interpretation. That's never how it's going to work, because it's all about an individual and what they need and what we can provide for them to access and participate in our space. And like we keep saying, but it's really important to make a friend for so many reasons. For your mental health, but also because it's also going to improve your accessibility and inclusive offerings at your institution by learning what other people are doing and being able to talk about that. And also hearing about maybe some difficult conversations other people might have had with guests, and learning what you could do differently next time.
Now we're going to talk a little bit more about what types of services we can offer. First thing we have is effective communication. The ADA requires cultural organizations to make it possible for individuals with speech, hearing, and vision disabilities to understand what is said or written and can communicate effectively. The goal with this is to ensure that we want to make sure that communicating with people with disabilities is in the effective format that they use, and it is as effective as communication with people without disabilities. So thinking about providing auxiliary aids or services in the individual's normal method of receiving communication when providing services, such as sign language, what's integral to the understanding of the content, captions, making sure that we are able to communicate effectively for online content with being screen reader compatible, maybe being able to provide large material or braille material, and just making sure that we can find all the means and channels of effective communication, and making sure we're meeting a patient where they're at and not making them feel like we're being burdened by some new way of doing something.
And one thing I'll add is a principle of inclusive design is redundancy, and that happens to be my favorite principle. But thinking about redundancy, typically we don't think of that as a positive, but when we're talking about accessibility, and especially when we're talking about effective communication, having these multiple formats, or basically repeating the content in different ways for people to understand it, is really essential. So we're going to look specifically at accommodations for hearing access. And one of the first ways that people who have hearing loss a way for them to participate in our cultural organizations is through assistive listening devices. And we have a photo on the left of a woman in a pink shirt who has an assistive listening device on, so she has a receiver kind of hooked on her belt, it looks like, and then she's wearing headphones. Or is she wearing, yeah, she's wearing headphones. And then we also have the access symbol for assistive listening devices. I'm making sure it's actually behind me. They have the access symbol for assistive listening devices, which is an ear that has sort of fancy dots and lines around it. So ALDs, assistive listening devices, amplify the sound being picked up by a microphone and lessen ambient noise. It is a requirement of the ADA to have assistive listening devices for events when microphones are used. This is something that can blow people's minds sometimes. So if you're using a microphone at your event, thinking about, do you have assistive listening devices available? Don't panic, because we'll talk more about how you can get your hands on some. You also can wear the receiver for an assistive listening device. You can use the headphones like the woman's using in the picture, or you can also use a neck loop. So if I had a cochlear implant or a hearing aid in, I could switch it. If I had a T coil, I could switch it to the T setting. And if I had a neck loop on, the sound would be transmitted directly into my hearing aid. And the cost for these vary. An FM transmitter and 12 devices can cost around $3,000.
But there's hope. We have the Borrowing an ALD kit from CCAC and the Equipment Loan Program. Yay! So this is a great opportunity for someone to check out this equipment, borrow it for short term for an event that you have, figure out what works best in your space, learn from folks who know how to use this equipment and kind of like gain confidence in it. And then there's the Theater Development Fund, TDF, a New York-based organization. They actually have a National Open Captions Initiative grant, which is actually due May 31st, which offers a 2-year partnership with professional regional theaters to sponsor open captioning performances. And then the image on the screen is it's a screenshot of CCAC's website showing the accessible equipment loans that they share with Steppenwolf, and kind of that will go through all the different things that we have and kind of tell you the ins and outs about it, and then how to kind of work with borrowing, it's not at cost, borrowing those items.
And one thing to point out is the whole reason behind having the CCAC and Steppenwolf Accessible Equipment Loan Program is really for you to try out the equipment and to use it, because a lot of times we were hearing from organizations like, there's no one with disabilities who comes to my organization, so I don't need to buy the equipment. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg argument. So you actually sometimes need to have the equipment and offer it, and then people come and use it, and you learn how to use it too. So ideally, at some point, this whole program will become obsolete because all of us will have the equipment. But until that point, we will have this program. And I will talk a little bit about American Sign Language Interpretation, or ASL. And then there's an image on this slide of 2 hands, and that is the universal symbol of ASL. So sign language comes in many different languages, but in America we use typically American Sign Language. Like we've talked about a few times already today, we shouldn't assume that just because somebody is deaf that they use ASL. So that's something really important to think about and realize. It's suggested that you set some sort of parameters for guests to be able to request American Sign Language interpretation, because it does take some time occasionally to find an interpreter and book an interpreter, and it isn't something that most institutions are ready and able to offer just as a person arrives for performance or arrives for a gallery talk. So usually there needs to be some lead time. So we suggest giving some sort of guidance when on your website, for instance, to say, we suggest giving us 2 weeks notice or more, for instance. It's not a requirement. If someone were to request American Sign Language today for a program today, you still should try to find an interpreter. But I think it's really useful to set expectations for your guests that it's going to take a little time to find somebody, and encourage people to plan ahead if they can. When you're thinking about, do you want to jump in, Rachel?
In terms of advanced notice, I would say then the shortage of sign language interpreters in the Chicago area. So the earlier you could work with interpreters, the better. But it's also okay to proactively schedule interpreters. We already anticipated need if that we've already thought ahead of that need that you could design closer to the date whether you need to close it that or not.
Right, or you could just promote it as being a program that's accessible with ASL, and then perhaps you get other deaf visitors to join in on that program. When you're booking at American Sign Language interpretation, things to think about if you're in a theater or you're in fixed seating, is thinking about sight lines where someone might need to be seated to see the interpreter. And there's a lot of thought and we could do a whole talk on that, and we actually will be doing something like that in June for CCAC, so we'll tell you more about that later. But you want to make sure you're considering that. If you're talking about a tour, you're thinking about a museum program that might be moving from place to place, making sure that that you talked with the person giving the tour, that they know that they need to stand close to the interpreter and to encourage the deaf person to come to the front. On some museum tours, they even use like a stool or something that the interpreter can stand on to make it easier for sightlines if you expect to have a lot of deaf people on the tour. And also thinking about what your frontline staff needs to know about American Sign Language tours. For instance, like Rachel was saying, just knowing that if you do have a tour or program in ASL that people know about it, and when someone asks, your staff can answer. But also knowing like if you're interacting with a guest who is deaf, you might not be able to verbally communicate what's going on. So if you don't know American Sign Language yourself, can just take a pad and a piece of paper and write it down, or use your phone and use the notes on your phone, for instance, would be a way to communicate, or point to it in your brochure.
And then thinking about how much this can cost. A live event interpreter tends to cost between $50 to $150 per hour. Once again, this is kind of a scale. It really depends on how much prep time is needed, how much access to materials that the interpreter might have. Learning a script for a theatrical performance is going to cost a ballpark around $450 as a flat rate. And in addition to thinking about what your patrons need, we're also, with that timeline, with the fact that there is, that suggested 2 weeks out of patrons communicating about needing an interpreter, we need to be thinking about what the interpreter really needs to be successful. Like scripts, maybe reviews if it's a performance that's been done before, being able to see the performance before, like a dress rehearsal, being able to do a sound check for the interpreter and their placement so that they can actually hear everything that's being said in real time. Thinking about lighting levels and what portion of the body, the head and upper chest, needs to be lit so that patrons can be fully partaking in the experience. And then, being able to just have that person, and I think we've talked about that, like having that person maybe at your organization who kind of can be that point of contact for both the patron and that interpreter. And in the image on this slide is a woman who's interpreting, and then there's another performer kind of in the background as she is interpreting.
And I actually, right now at the Evanston Arts Center, there is a program where there's an ESL interpreter. And some of the things that I gave to this interpreter in advance, because I'm not coming from a theater background, I'm coming more from an arts background, and it's an art talk with art making. And I had a PDF of terminology that's going to be used, especially when we're talking about art. We're talking specifically about paper in this program. So some terminology to help prepare the interpreter so that they know what the heck we're even talking about today.
I think that it would be much easier to find an appropriate interpreter if you go through a sign language interpreter agency. Right now there are a lot of foreign language agencies that provide spoken language services, and some of them have added up providing sign language interpreter services. However, in the field of sign language interpreting has a lot of rules, and they have a code of ethics that sign language interpreters have to follow that you don't necessarily see in spoken language interpretation. So I would suggest going to an sign language interpreting agency. We're happy to share names with you.
It's actually on your Getting Started resource sheet. Yeah. So, like we've mentioned, if you're deaf, that doesn't mean that you use American Sign Language. And because this is a very cursory introduction, we also haven't really talked a lot about capital D deaf versus lowercase d deaf. And so we're not going to get into that too much, but that's a really interesting and important area to learn more about, which is to say that that ASL is not just a language, it's also a whole culture around it. And so capital D deaf means you identify with the deaf culture. And there's some really cool books and resources that we could recommend after this to talk more about that. But so just because you're deaf doesn't mean you use ASL. It also could mean that you would benefit from using open captioning. And open captioning is also benefiting people who have hearing loss as well as who might be profoundly deaf. It might also be benefiting people who are English language learners or people with learning disabilities. I don't identify as having any of those disabilities, but I really like captioning because it helps me focus. So there's a lot of positives with open captioning in particular, I think. But open captioning, we're seeing it right now, displays dialogue and describes other relevant sounds on screen above the stage or to the side of the stage. Captions often are typed in real time by a professional captioner in the venue. To my right is Kathy Raycan, who's typing furiously as I'm speaking. And then open captions provide access for people at any stage of hearing loss, so that's another important piece to know. And CART there's so many acronyms when we're talking about accessibility. So CART stands for Communication Access Real Time. And that is what's happening right now, what you're experiencing. There's also different ways where if you had a scripted performance, you could kind of do your own, we call them DIY captions, where you would use kind of like PowerPoint slides to advance from slide to slide. And we can talk more about that at a different time too. But the cost may be around, and this is all ballpark, would be $150 per hour to have CART. And we have two images right here of open captions. One is using an LED screen, and it is a really cool grab of, because another reason why I love captioning, open captioning, is because you can, if you have a photo, you can see what's being talked about. And so the dialogue of this performance is, "And of a foolish night that you brought in one night here." I'm saying it kind of dramatically. It seems like an important moment of this play. We see a set, and somebody looks like they might be dead in someone else's arms. So that's on stage, and that's an example of an LED screen, which is one way to provide captioning. Another example is a photo from the Chicago Humanities Festival, where there are two people seated in comfy chairs, and it says in really big letters, Chicago Humanities Festival in the background. It's their logo. But then on top, similar to what we see here, is text on top, so the captioning is happening on the screen behind us.
So how is open captioning different from closed captioning? Closed captions are visible to fewer people, usually on a device like a television or a YouTube video. They can be turned on and off. You'll see, like in the movie theaters as well, you might have folks who have their own personal device that has the captions running. It's a personal experience where open captions is going to be something that's visible to the entire audience, such as our text on top here, or screen placements at the front of a stage, where there's no turning them off. It's something that everyone can take advantage of. Folks who don't identify, they might really access it more than they ever thought they would, but it's something that's going to be throughout. There's a picture of Dame Maggie Smith. The Dowager. Is this from the Dowager?
The Dowager Duchess is from Downton Abbey.
Oh,
I thought you did that for sure.
No,
Perfect.
I couldn't. I figured Maggie Smith. I feel like there are so many still shots of Maggie Smith in this exact outfit. But then in the text in that is, but that is precisely what they already know. Very scary. But yes, that's kind of an example of like something on a personal device that would be closed captioning. And then something great about CCAC is that you can actually borrow a TV screen or a projector and screen for captions from CCAC as part of the equipment loan program. Once again, this is kind of a way for you, as a stepping stone, for you all to find out what works best for you and can hopefully support yourself with equipment in the future as you plan budgeting and access. But we have really great resources, and we'll have resources to share too about some services that you can look into for captioners.
So let's shift gears for a bit and talk about accommodations for physical access. And a lot of times when I do sessions like this, I might start out, if we have a little bit more time, to say, like, what do you think of when you think of people with disabilities? And some people might have really great examples, or might be a person with disabilities themselves, but a lot of times I feel like you think of like somebody using a wheelchair or thinking about physical access as really the only access that we're talking about. But that's just a piece of it, but it's also an important piece. So 6.4% of the Illinois population has a mobility disability. And remembering that that could be a wheelchair user, it also could be someone using a walker or a rollator. That's like the fancy walkers that like older people have now that have a little seat built in. Canes, powered mobility devices, a scooter, or they might not use any assistive devices at all. Some quick etiquette tips just to note when you're interacting with people who have mobility disabilities: don't lean or hang on a person's wheelchair. Push a person, and do not push a person's wheelchair or mobility device unless asked. If we had one of our friends from CCAC, Risa, here, she could tell a story about standing in line at Disney World and somebody leaning against her scooter and what she did next, which was keep moving, and the person fell over a little bit. I think they're okay. But remembering that it's somebody's personal space, we do encourage you to try to sit or put yourself at the eye level of somebody using a wheelchair, or somebody might be a little person or a low stature, to be able to actually have a good conversation. And really, we encourage you, whenever we're talking about anyone with any type of disabilities, ask if anyone needs help or wants to know the different options that you have available.
And now thinking about some of the accommodations that we can provide for mobility disabilities, accessible entrances and routes throughout the patron experience is someone, I kind of view this as how independent of an experience can somebody have from start to finish of their time in our space. So really thinking about that and what that means. ADA does have some pretty interesting and tricky to read ticketing regulations for seats. So that's definitely something in older venues, in spaces where you might not have the means of just doing immediate infrastructure changes. There's a lot of good information out there about seating and making sure that you have seating across all levels of price zones, and as much as you can do to have in different options of seating levels. Thinking about proper reach ranges and wheelchair clearance for exhibits. So if you're in the museum setting, gallery setting, I'm thinking about how folks can interact with the gallery. Can they actually, if it's an exhibit that's been built where you have to go into it to experience it, can that patron access that exhibit? Has the person designing this exhibit thought about access at the forefront of how this is going to be totally created? Seating with and without armrests throughout your experience, and that's a comfort level for a variety of patrons with a variety of level of experience and comfort. So making sure that you have those options. Wheelchairs available for visitors. If you're able to have like a courtesy wheelchair that somebody could check out with your staff. So that also goes in line with making sure that your frontline staff knows how to operate a wheelchair, how to lock the wheels, how to make sure that somebody is braced enough to transfer to and from a wheelchair, and what their role is if they don't necessarily have a companion with them. Accessible restroom stalls, thinking about family all gender inclusive restrooms, or that option of what you can make be that. And how we communicate our physical access through our website, pathways, describing where accessible seating locations are, thinking about our signage when people are on site, and how we make sure that that's visible in a way that people know they can maintain that independence as much as they can.
And one thing we really recommend for CCAC is to really own your access. We all want to get better, but we all have limitations, and I think there's a tendency to paint a rosy picture on what we offer. Like, we offer one ASL interpretive performance a year, and that's all that it says. Or when you look at different people's access pages on their website, for instance. So I would really encourage you, especially for physical access, to be really straightforward and honest about what the experience is like for somebody who would be using a wheelchair. Like, we have an accessible entrance, but it's in the back. So I'm going to tell you about that. Or we have one stair and then it's fine. So explaining what that stair, there's that one stair. So if I was ambulatory, but I had a physical disability, so like I could walk around, but I might have some difficulty, I would need to know that in advance, and I'd appreciate knowing that in advance. And even if you're in a historic home that's up 10 stairs, saying how many stairs are on that stairway and kind of giving people the option to choose for themselves if they want to come or not.
And then just to kind of describe the next image, just kind of gives you an example of how you can have visual indicators of where your accessible seating areas are. This is a picture of kind of a crowded venue, and there's a red arrow pointing to a seat that's been covered with like the universal wheelchair symbol. So this is a venue that maybe it's a general admission house, and the team coming in needs to reserve seats for access, and ways you can do that are clear, and you know, a clear indicator that that's what that space is reserved for.
Now we're going to talk a bit about accommodations for visual access. And one way that you can really help ensure that guests who are blind or have low vision feel welcomed in your space is making sure that your frontline staff in particular has sighted guide training, so they're able to, well, if they notice that there is a guest who is blind or has low vision, they could approach that guest, identify themselves, and then offer the service of being able to escort them with their hand on their arm or on their shoulder to where they need to go. And that is a key and really important way that you can help guests who are blind or have low vision feel welcomed. You should just, I think, work this into all of your staff training, but especially if you were doing a performance with audio description, which we'll talk about in a second, or doing a tour for people who are blind or have low vision, making sure that the frontline staff or their security guards, like, they all know how to do this if they notice somebody's lost. And speaking from my experience, I got super lost coming here today, and I was really wandering around with all the snacks on and I really needed some help. Ended up finding my way. I'm sighted. I was able to get here A-okay, but it would have been really great, especially if I was blind and kind of in a new place, to have somebody help guide me to where I needed to go.
And then audio description, that's a service that you can provide for people who are blind or low vision. What that is, it uses, it provides additional narration that describes key visual components and unspoken action of a piece of visual media or live performance. And the narration is actually transmitted via the assistive listening devices. So it's something where you can get a twofold usage out of those devices. It can also, you know, when it comes to audio description, there's a lot of really cool additional things that can be brought to the patron experience. Thinking more specifically in the theater setting or concert hall setting, it's a good opportunity to do performance notes or program notes before an engagement. For those who are blind or low vision, you can provide, as Christina mentioned earlier, some vocab for performances, or being able to kind of, if maybe you're doing audio description for dance, and it's a very specific style of dance, and you want to be able to provide like the correct language for being on point or any kind of dance, obviously. Arabesque. Ooh, yes, very nice. So, or being able to describe the sets before the engagement begins, or the character profiles. There's just so much richness that can be added to the patron experience through this narration. And then also the images for this page, there is the universal symbol for audio description, which is a capital A-D with some like little half arc lines coming out of the D. And then there's an image of a woman in a production booth or sound booth, audio describing. She's got the headset on, she's got a clear line of sight of the stage. And then there's another picture of a gentleman who has the assistive listening device receiver kind of on his chest. And then also, in addition to that, audio description, you can also provide touch tours, which is providing access to the stage and set before a performance to like firm up the descriptive information. You know, they might go onto the set, a patron might go onto the set and like feel the texture of things, or be able to feel the costumes and learn more tactilely about what's happening. I know there's been, for dance, for example, you know, you might bring a dancer out and they go up on point, and maybe the patron can feel their foot and how that's shaped, and really kind of have that experience. Typically, touch tours are led by a staff member who describes the visual artistic choices. Guests explore the space and they'll handle costumes, props, furniture. Sometimes, depending on who you're working with as an audio describer, you can really incorporate them as well in a touch tour to be a part of that experience, giving them another layer of connection and community with those patrons before they're audio describing that night or in that space. And also, audio description equipment can be borrowed from the CCAC's Steppenwolf Equipment Loan Program. So yes, more fun things that you can, if you're starting down this journey and are really curious about what that is and what that entails, there's a lot of knowledgeable people in this room that can really, answer some questions and, get you connected.
Verbal description is similar to audio description. Audio description we typically think of in a theater performance setting, and verbal description is more so in the museum setting, which is why I get to talk about it. But it's very similar in a lot of ways because you're describing visual information that's happening. But the big difference is audio description is typically done in the pauses between dialogue. So usually audio describers get like 2 words that they can utter between the lines to be like, she held the gun, or something really important that you need to communicate. The nice part about verbal description is typically it's done working in real time with guests who are blind or have low vision in a tour setting. So you're able in the galleries to actually have a conversation with the guests to understand where they're coming from, to know like if they have a background, if we're talking about art, like they have an art history background before they lost their sight. This is really useful information that's going to totally shape your tour and the way you're going to describe the visual elements of things. So verbal description is really working to describe visual elements of works of art or whatever exhibit or artifacts you might have on display. It's really the object of doing verbal description is to help the viewer visualize the work of art in their mind. Another term that people use is verbal imaging, so actually visualizing the image in your mind. There's a lot of really interesting research out there that I'd be happy to talk with you about later. So typically it's done in a smaller group, and it also, like a touch tour, you'd want to include other multisensory elements. Like I've seen touch tours that include scent, that include, or multisensory elements like actually touching things, raised line drawings, for instance, or if we're looking at a painting of a woman in a silk dress, maybe we would bring a sample of silk and have the viewers touch that instead.
And then just to kind of add to, we talked a little bit about this with ASL interpreters and the prep they need. Same goes for if you have someone who's doing audio description for you. There are some really great things that they can have that providing to that service provider will help them. Program notes, giving them an opportunity to see the performance beforehand or to walk the exhibit on their own and get a good sense of what's happening in the space, and just kind of any additional maybe recording of something. These are all really helpful things that as you're prepping this to be a really good experience that we can provide as the venue. Multiple formats as well in terms of for low vision would be Braille and large print. So on this image we have the universal symbol for Braille, which is like 6 round dots in 2 rows, and then large print material is just the word large print. In large print. Important to offer key information and content in multiple formats, including Braille, large print, and electronically in a readable PDF or Word document. If you offer important info in print, you should consider offering these materials in Braille and large print too. For blind and low vision guests, there's a lot of pretty inexpensive ways to do large print programs or large print materials, and local and online vendors can have materials made in Braille for a few dollars a sheet. Do you want to do your research? And large print can be achieved cheaply by photocopying your existing brochures at 130% size. So it's really just about increasing that. You're not necessarily need to carry on all those maybe graphic design detail or things that maybe if a program book you might have. It's really just about getting that context for things that are integral to the understanding of what's happening.
And just like we said with deaf people and ASL, just because you're deaf doesn't mean you use ASL. Just because you're blind doesn't mean that you use Braille. And there's a statistic that we didn't include here, but it's only a small percentage of people who are blind actually read Braille. It's kind of dying out just because of the prevalence of online materials. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't do Braille. You should do Braille if you're able to, but Braille is not the only format that you should be providing. And online and accessible PDFs and Word documents are really, I think, the key for where you should head. And then thinking more about being online and thinking about your website, that's huge when we're talking about people who are blind or have low vision. A lot of people who are blind use the internet and are able to really have very full lives online. They're able to do this because of screen readers, and so that's basically the easy way to describe it is just everything's read what's on the page. And there are ways that programmers I'm not a programmer, but there are ways that a programmer can program it so that there's the most important information read first, and then it's sort of prioritized, for instance. And so that is really important to be thinking about when we think about our websites, and we know how important our websites are. So some easy things you can do are when you can use alt text when uploading images to your website or eBlast. So an alt text would be to describe what the image is. So if it was like a headshot of Christina Gunther, it would say headshot of Christina Gunther rather than maybe the really long name of the JPEG that the photo was titled. That would be an example. You really do not want to convey textual information within an image only. So if you created this really sweet PDF with really great graphics, but it's not a PDF, a really sweet JPEG with really great graphics, but it's only in this JPEG, you want to make sure you're putting the date and the other things that are really important for people to know into the text as well, so that if someone's using a screen reader, it's really clear that they're not missing out on the information that you have.
We're going to talk a little bit about accommodations for guests with cognitive disabilities and those on the autism spectrum. So communication with guests with cognitive disabilities, just some context here, 4% of Illinois population would identify as having cognitive disability. That would be inclusive of autism spectrum, Down syndrome, Alzheimer's, other sensory processing disorders. When you're trying to design programs or language for guests with cognitive disabilities, we want to make sure we're using straightforward instructions, avoiding idioms, avoiding things that could be interpreted or hard to interpret and not that isn't a straightforward instruction. Speak directly to a person and try to be age appropriate with how you're speaking to someone and how you're communicating with someone. Listen attentively, being patient and waiting for people to finish. That's really a pretty good practice for any interaction that you have with someone. Don't pretend that you understand if you don't. Ask for clarification, ask for repetition. This goes with a lot of different ways too. If you don't understand something, maybe there's a different format that works best for that individual to communicate with you.
And I just wanted to jump in for a sec. And I don't have a disability, but I do have a brother with Down syndrome, and that's what led me to this work. And just some of those points that we put on the slide are really important. If my brother and I go to a restaurant, sometimes the server will just look to me to order for my brother, and he's perfectly capable of ordering. Or they'll talk down to him or give him I don't know why it's only restaurant examples, but I'm kind of hungry. But only give him the children's menu to color or something like that. He picks up on that very well and knows when people are not treating him as an adult. And he is 31 and a half years old and would like to be treated that way.
And then sensory-friendly and relaxed programs. You see a lot of these in the city. There's a lot of different organizations doing these types of programs. What this is really just creating a setting and environment that's a little bit more relaxed and allowing patrons to have a more options for how they're experiencing their day. A lot of times when organizations are doing sensory-friendly, a lot of what you see is a lot of children, a younger adult-based programming, maybe at a different time of day that would be less crowded. I know some museums will maybe do an open early for an hour before the general open up the rest of the museum or gallery, where that is specifically for folks who are on the spectrum or have some type of sensory processing disorder. They can come and experience it without the crowds, minimalizing that aspect for them. You provide a quiet area for someone if they need to take a break. If they maybe are experiencing a bit of a sensory overload, they can take a moment to be away from that space. Relaxed environment where it's okay to make noise. We're encouraging that through our communications of this is a no shush environment. you come as you are, you're experiencing this performance as you are, in the way that you can. Relaxed environment where the lights are raised so guests can come in and out as needed. It's not that traditional like dark theater setting or space setting where you don't feel okay leaving. A scent-free environment. There's also a lot of importance with creating these types of programs to create some structure of pre-performance materials that families can use to help with the day structure, such as social stories and visual schedules, which are really great tools that outline what someone is experiencing when they come to your space. What is their first interaction with the space? They go to the box office, they walk through the lobbies. It's really giving you that structure, kind of a bullet point of what's happening in their experience through that day. And then the images, there's the top left image is like a really relaxed performance setting. It's like a concert setting of looks like a little quartet, concerto style performance, and everyone's kind of on the floor on blankets, and it's a mixed age group of individuals experience that in this light and bright setting. And then the other picture, it's kind of hard to see the wording, but this is an example of what you could find in a social narrative for an outdoor space. There's a woman showing a young girl a butterfly, and the words below it say, "A butterfly might land on me, and that is okay. Butterflies will not hurt me, and it might tickle a little. I can look at the butterflies, but I should not touch them." So thinking about how we create the environment and the language that's accessible, and you can see mom and dad at home going through this narrative with their child in preparation of coming to the space, to the zoo, to the show, to the museum. There's a lot of great organizations in the city that are doing performances specifically sensory friendly for young adults. That's starting to pop up a lot more and more. So that's definitely something where you see a desire for that. So we're having more age appropriate things for the older, for the young adults that are on the spectrum as well.
And we want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions. So we're going to kind of, I think, sum up some of these points, and then we want to make sure we leave time for you. And I hope you've been texting Evan a lot. And he really likes to receive gifts and Bitmojis. So feel free to send those to him as well. But some things to keep in mind when we're talking about all audiences, that a lot of what we're talking about, we're just like listing lots of different things because we want to just show you the possibilities that we know access is not just about physical access, it's about many different pieces and components. But you should never be building any of these programs without working with people with disabilities themselves. And I think we know this from other work that's happening when we're talking about racial equity and other pieces like that. But we should not, as institutions, be presuming what people need to interact with our space. And so there's a really great credo that was part of the disability rights movement, which is nothing about us without us. So making sure that that's at the center of whatever you're doing. Remembering that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. We need to create a way for guests to request an accommodation or have a conversation with you if what you're offering isn't going to work for them. Remembering and training your staff that if someone requests something you can't do or you've never done before, have a conversation with that person first. A lot of times, I feel like if you don't know what people are talking about, the knee-jerk reaction is to be like, sorry, we don't do that. But I would really encourage you to take a beat, to say, let me get back to you. You don't have to say yes, but say, let me get back to you, and then have some conversations with folks in your institution or CCAC folks or anyone else at another institution, because your first response should never be to say no. Rachel mentioned this too, but some accommodations are scheduled. So we encourage you, if you're going to offer and you're interested in offering a tour in American Sign Language or a program in American Sign Language, you can offer it without a request and try it and encourage and work with the deaf community or whoever your audience is to encourage them to come to the show. That's how the word of mouth and that's how things get built. You also need to be prepared to receive and respond to requests that people have. Maybe they can't come to the tour that day, so maybe you need to budget some more money if somebody asks for another performance or program to be accessible. And then a big thing to keep in mind that I'm sure none of you would think of, but you might need to say this to a colleague, is to say that the ADA prohibits passing the cost on to the visitors. So you can't just give the deaf visitor the bill for the ASL interpreter at the end of the session. That is not how it works.
And then we also want to make sure that that we are letting folks know that we're welcoming of service animals. This is a huge topic of the conversation. One of those things that we could talk about for hours about service animals and those practices and customer service with that. But making sure that it's visible on your website, that your staff is trained in what can be asked, what can't be asked when a service animal is in the space. And then in the picture, there's a patron using a wheelchair with a service animal coming into a space.
So we had more that we hope to talk about right now, but we want to leave time for questions. We will be sending out a PDF, or readable PDF, don't worry, of the PowerPoint to all of you, and we also had printed copies out front. So you can find out more that way, and then come to another CCAC program and keep learning more. So let's have some questions. Evan, have you been receiving some texts?
I have. And afterwards, if you want to go for a drink, I can audio describe some of the gifts I got.
Okay.
The topic of working directly with people with disabilities got a few hits. I think the general question to synthesize is if you're trying to build relationships with people with disabilities and bring them to collaborate, what's a good way of going about doing that?
Rachel, do you want to do that one first?
I think that you have to start from scratch. Start with one. If there's one or two people that come to your position, talk to them, get their feedback. So, for example, when Stephen started providing open captioning back in 2012, I would go to the performance and Everett would come by and check out the accessible seating, and then afterwards, as I was leaving, he would say, hey, how was the show? How was your experience? And then we would get to talking about my experience about the show, and Everett was always there after the show, and that was a really nice touch because then I knew that I could provide any feedback. So who would this about it be available and accessible? And then I was able to say to my friends, man, I had an awesome time at Stepperform. You should check out their show. And then, of course, it didn't hurt that Stepperform had a show that involved people with disabilities. They produced a play called Tribes in 2013, which is about a deaf man who looks for his identity and people with disabilities. I'm not going to stereotype, but many people with disabilities now see stories about people with disabilities on stage or in a museum, and because it helps us feel that we're seen, that our experiences are valued. So through Stepperform, that brought it over 800 deaf and hard of hearing people through the doors, and Stepperform, that was really powerful. So that's something to keep in mind in your master plan too.
And I'd also say to use the CCAC listserv. So by coming here, we will add you to the listserv, and you may unsubscribe at any time. But hopefully you'll stay on, and you can ask questions of the group. We have over 900 email addresses now of people interested in accessibility in the Chicago area. So if you want to get started working with a different group of people with disabilities, I'd say, like, I'm looking to have a focus group for people who are blind or have low vision. Does anyone have any connections? And I think that would be a really good first step to just get started and get to know some people. There's also people, service providers and people from larger organizations, social service organizations that serve people with disabilities that are on that list. And then also with some simple Google searching, you could find some more people to get connected and get things going.
The other thing you could do is partner with other organizations. So, for example, if you are a leader and you want to provide open captioning, you can ask your fellow leaders to help spread the word about other caption shows too. So I would partner up with each other too.
And I think that's the cool part about working in this field of cultural accessibility is that while we might in some ways be competitors, we might all be vying for audience members. the Access community, at least in my experience, has been super open and really willing to share everything, including they maybe won't give you email addresses of people who come to shows, but they'll forward your email to those folks on their list, and so there's a lot of goodwill.
I think the companion question digs a little bit deeper about the relationship building. I've been in my job for just over a year, and I'm trying to figure out how to make my company more accessible. I just got an email from a person with a disability that said we have a negative reputation in the community. Do you have any tips for not just building trust, but repairing it?
I think that you need to find out why is there a negative reputation. I would invite that person who sent you that feedback to come and meet with you, go out for a cup of coffee, and to ask more questions. I know that it could be scary and not fun to receive negative feedback, but you need to understand why you're getting that feedback, and then you probably come up with a plan on how to fix it. Or maybe there are gaps in the customer service that could be improved too, but I think you need to understand why by that person sharing that with you. They're almost telling you that they want you to improve. I mean, when I email cultural representation, requesting access, when I ask for access, I'm telling you I want to have a relationship with you, and nothing breaks my heart faster than the representation saying, no, we can't do it. People, it's hard to be told. No, but I am, out of all of the cultural outreach, I identified you and I said, I want to come to your museum or theater, and you were not able to make it work. So, if you say no, it does make it much harder to overcome that in the future. So really try to work it out, or try to work with the person you see, maybe be clear to them, but here are some alternatives we can work with. Would any of these work for now, and they're going through, but we want to continue to improve. I mean, this is a access journey. We are all on this journey. Nobody is perfect, but we're out here to support each other and maybe start. Everybody who provided access started somewhere.
Yeah, I would agree, really working to repair that relationship. If you had make good tickets at a theater, or you could give free admission tickets to your museum to that person as an apology perhaps, and then also doing a walkthrough with them, not only meeting with them, but if they felt comfortable, could I experience the space as you do, and kind of going through it with them would also be really helpful. And maybe after doing that, it doesn't work out, I would still say to pursue it, but then also to try some other options of reaching out to CCAC listserv, but also other organizations, and trying to reach out to other patrons with maybe who are blind or have low vision or deaf or hard of hearing, to try to do better next time. I think that's the other piece too, is we're on this journey and we are always improving, and we've never mentioned in this conversation that I remember where we said we're 100% compliant at our institutions, because I would never say that, because there's always something different or a new issue or a new kind of fun challenge that might arise that we have to tackle together and figure out solutions together. So we're never gonna say we've got this covered. We're gonna say, let's have a conversation and figure it out.
We have a couple of questions that focus on youth. The first specifically about children with disabilities. Are there any tools or resources that you know of for accessibility to provide for children with disabilities? Citing the example, for instance, captioning would not be appropriate for a person who is too young to read. So again, to focus the question, any more tips and resources for serving children with disabilities?
I would feel that that would be where you can really call upon some of the service providers in the area. I think that's a lot. There's a lot of great organizations within the city that are really eager to partner with cultural organizations to, help use their knowledge of occupational therapy, physical therapy, whatever area they're in, to help you craft some programs that could be more accessible to a younger audience. I know, for example, where I'm at the Harris Theater, And we did a partnership this last year with a service organization, and they really, really helped with our social narrative and thinking about how we can create that language and craft that to be more accessible and more of a learning tool for students who have cognitive, or children who have cognitive disabilities, and really putting it in that perspective of someone who's living it every day and working with these students. So that's something that we found very valuable in my institution.
I'd also say like the Chicago Children's Theater would be a great resource because they do a lot of fantastic programming. They have the Red Kite Project for kids on the autism spectrum, and also have done a good job of incorporating accessibility for younger audiences. The Chicago Children's Museum, looking to see what they're providing. I know that they have a quiet room that they've been working to develop, different pieces like that. I would also say you don't want to exclusively rely on talking to parents of kids with disabilities, but that could be another path to say, like, what do you need? Growing up with a brother with a disability, and I didn't have a disability, I always felt like the focus was always on my brother, like whatever he needed. But my parents would like be so happy to talk with somebody about what they would need for both my brother and me to have a good experience. So reaching out to parents, just making sure that parents aren't the only people you're talking to, because we want to make sure that people with disabilities themselves are speaking for themselves too. But maybe like even if you're talking specifically about those on the autism spectrum, maybe talking to an autistic adult about what they wish they would have had as a kid. So trying to connect with different people in different ways like that would be a way I'd suggest.
Yeah, so the Chicago Children's Museum does provide captioning too, so I'm not sure what each the question had in mind, but I would not rule out captioning. I mean, I never had captioning growing up here in Chicago, and I would have known that as a kid. So you have to look at what main video audience and what the needs are. And then could be to do that as a partner with schools that have different hard of hearing programs too.
And also remembering that parents could have disabilities too. So there's also like there's a disabled parents network, which is really interesting. So remembering that maybe the child isn't the one with the disability, but it could be a parent. So that, for instance, the captioning at the Children's Museum could be beneficial to the adults who are present, because hopefully there's some adults there too.
I have so many friends who are deaf, who are parents, and they complain about how they want to take their kids to age-appropriate programming, but they can't participate because it's not accessible to them. So they miss out on that opportunity to have that conversation and that shared experience of as an incredibly bad and improve to great.
Thank you.
We have a couple more really fantastic questions that have just come in. To hop in real quick, I would suggest that the model that you're seeking may not already exist. May not already be done somewhere, which means you get to team up with your audience and build something really cool. Another question, aging up a little bit, I'm going to be working with about 20 teens for the summer, and this summer for the first time since I've been there, we have one teen who uses a wheelchair. We do have a disability training that we provide our teens with since they are public facing, and I'm a little nervous about teens asking questions that would make this teen feel singled out or put undue pressure on this teen to answer on behalf of the whole community during our well-meaning training. Any thoughts on how to navigate this type of training or those questions that continue to make everyone feel included?
So if you feel comfortable, I would reach out to the teenager themselves and say, hey, we would love to have a really credit for you. What do you suggest? What would you like us to do? What would not make you feel comfortable? And maybe then student mainly but want to help explain their own experience, but they may not want to. But I think it would be nice to include them in the process. What I think I would not do is a simulation of a disability. For example, putting up labels or testing out wheelchair. There's a lot of evidence out there that says that this is not affect him. It is actually detrimental because when you experience that kind of experience, you are still looking at it through your own perspective and not at the whole disability experience. Here there are studies that say that most effective way to give that understanding is to talk to a person with a disability. You also want to be proactive about your programming and make sure that every single activity is accessible and include the whole group. For example, to make the student take an elevator all by themselves, while everybody uses the stand. That's such a no-need feeling. What I would do instead is have everybody go into the elevator. So keep that in mind for other summer activities.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
And we do have a few more that we're not going to be able to get to, but we would love to follow up afterwards and talk more, and we can do that either by text and connect over email or in person. We're going to be hanging out in the lobby for a few minutes afterwards. But thanks to everyone for chiming in. There's some really fantastic thought here. Do you have any suggestions for, this is a hypothetical, I love hypotheticals. Do you have any suggestions for navigating a hypothetical situation where a video artist feels open captions would compromise the visual experience of their artwork? Which I think also goes to the question of, this is distracting to the rest of the audience.
Well, one point of clarification when we're talking about open captioning for works of art, it is not required by the ADA because it's considered a work of art. So we don't have to provide the captions, but I would say educating the artist, if possible, about how this could be more accessible to everyone. I think also pointing out that, I don't know where this would be installed, but that there's also all of this other ambient noise that might be spilling over that might make it hard for hearing people. If they're not going to think about people who are deaf or hard of hearing, thinking about hearing person experience, that might be impacted. Those would be some of the things I think of, or if this is going to live online later for the people who are watching at work, because I watch a lot of videos at work, I guess, that where I don't put the sound up, the captions are really helpful. What else would you say?
So this actually didn't happen in the museum visually, in response the museum. So as Christina said, the video, it was like two videos next to each other. They don't have to be accessible, but the artists missed out on the opportunity to share their unique perspective with an audience that may have hearing class. The museum instead put up transcripts that you could read. I'm not sure that I got the full experience from the transcript, but that what the museum did was they followed up with the artists and they had a conversation about accessibility in their hopes encouraging the artists to make video type artwork accessible. It does come from the artists too, so I think that we can help communicate our priorities to artists to explain to them who is going to miss out when it's not accessible, when they push back.
And there increasingly is like this large network of cultural organizations that are trying to become more accessible, and so issues related to video art have come up at lots of different places, but like I can think of like the Whitney Museum of American Art as an example, and I'd be happy to connect you with those folks who dealt with that, but if that's another way is to talk to other organizations that maybe have faced something similar to see if they were able to find a workaround. We really are so happy that you guys were here today, and we'll keep making incremental changes together.
Fade to black. White text on black background. Intro to Cultural Accessibility for Visitors with Disabilities. Presented by Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium. For workshop resources and more information, visit chicagoculturalaccess.org. Presenting speakers. Christina Gunther, CCAC founder and president and director of education at Evanston Art Center. Hillary Pearson, CCAC Steering Committee member and Manager of Operations at Harris Theater for Music and Dance. Rachel Arfa, CCAC Steering Committee member and staff attorney at Equip for Equality. Workshop Accessibility. Kathy Raycan, Real-Time Captioning. Video editing, captioning, and audio description by BridgetMelton.com. Video fades to black.